For 22 years, my world was a universe of bone. It was a place of elegant, unyielding logic, governed by the beautiful and brutal axioms of biology. In the sterile theatre of the Oakhaven Human Identification Laboratory, I was not a man who conversed with the dead. I was a translator. I took the silent, stark testimony of skeletal remains and rendered it into the language of the living. Cause of death, age at passing, the subtle markers of ancestry, the healed fractures of a life lived, and the perimortem trauma of a life taken. My job, as I saw it, was to read the history of a life written in bone. Disease, trauma, age, ancestry. It was all there, a biological ledger waiting to be balanced. I brought order to the chaos of human tragedy, and in that clinical, dispassionate process, I found a profound sense of peace. I remember case 7B-291, the cold case involving a twin-engine Cessna that went down in the Cascades in the winter of '78. For decades, it was just a ghost story for local hikers. When a receding glacier finally surrendered the wreckage, we were brought in. The remains were a commingled nightmare of shattered fragments. My job was to rebuild identities from that chaos. For 6 months, I lived in the quiet hum of my lab, the scent of antiseptic cleaner a constant companion. I worked with dental picks and calipers, my hands steady under the cold, white light of the surgical lamp. I recall the singular moment of triumph when I matched the unique curvature of a fragmented mandible to the dental records of a young man who had been listed as missing for 35 years. A piece of a jawbone, nothing more. But in it, I saw the truth. It was a puzzle with a definitive solution. Every bone, every fragment, every microscopic detail adhered to the known laws of physics and biology. That case was the epitome of my career. Difficult, complex, but ultimately knowable. This preamble is necessary. You must understand the foundation upon which my life was built. You must understand the man I was before I was assigned case WF 1138. Woods find 1138. It arrived on a Tuesday in late autumn, a day like any other, under a sky the colour of slate. It was just another case number, another set of remains in a refrigerated transport box. But the truth of what we found in that box does not belong in the world I knew. It violates the ledger. It is a story not of biology, but of something altogether more terrifying. The file for WF 1138 sits on my desk even now, years after my resignation. Officially, it is closed. But for me, it remains open, not because I don't know who she was, but because I do not believe she was alone in that grave. And what was with her was impossible. The next morning, the remains of WF 1138 arrived. There was no ceremony to it. A white, unmarked county coroner's van backed up to the loading bay, its reverse warning beeping a mournful, rhythmic pulse in the damp air. 2 technicians there, faces impassive with the practiced detachment of their profession, wheeled the sealed transport container into my examination suite. The air conditioning hissed, a sterile sound that I had always found comforting. The container itself was cold, to the touch, a stainless steel box promising a familiar tragic puzzle within. After signing the chain of custody forms, I was left alone. The lab was my sanctuary. Polished concrete floors, stainless steel tables, and the faint, clean smell of sodium hypochlorite. The only sound was the low, steady hum of the ventilation system. I unsealed the container and began my work, the ritual of it a comfort against the grim reality. First, the meticulous process of laying out the bones on the primary examination table in proper anatomical position. A silent, skeletal greeting. Even through my nitrile gloves, I could tell the preservation was excellent. The damp forest soil had been kind. The initial findings unfolded exactly as I would have predicted. The subpubic angle and the wide sciatic notch of the pelvis indicated female. The degree of epiphyseal fusion on the long bones, combined with the state of the cranial sutures, placed her age between 17 and 19. A life barely begun. Across the left parietal bone of the cranium, a spiderweb of radiating fractures told the story of her end. A single devastating application of blunt force trauma. Time of death, based on the minimal adiposa formation and the state of collagen. Degradation was roughly 18 to 24 months prior. It was all textbook. A tragic, brutal, but wholly unremarkable case. I felt the familiar, somber satisfaction of drawing a clear and legible story from the chaos of violence. The board was set, the pieces were in place. All that remained was the fine detail analysis. This is where my world came undone. The final stage of a preliminary exam involves microscopy, a closer look at the bone's own structure to refine the age estimate and check for pathological conditions. To do this, I prepared a thin cross-section from the femur. The femur, the thigh bone, is the largest in the body, and its internal structure is a rich source of information. Think of it like a support column in a building. From the outside, it's a solid pillar of cortical bone. But on the inside, there's a complex, reinforcing matrix known as trabecular bone. It's a delicate, spongy lattice that provides strength without excessive weight. Under a microscope, this lattice tells a story of the individual's health and age. I placed the slide onto the stage of my scanning electron microscope, the image appearing on the large monitor beside me. I expected to see the familiar, porous, off-white architecture of healthy trabecular bone. Instead, I saw an invasion. Embedded deep within the lattice, fused into the very matrix of the host bone, were alien structures. They were microscopic, to be sure, but their appearance was utterly wrong. They were dark, almost obsidian black, with a sharp, crystalline structure that glittered under the microscope's light. They were not mineral deposits, which have a cloudy, amorphous look. They were not any pathology I had ever seen or read about in my 22 years. They looked, for all the world, like microscopic splinters of ancient, fossilized bone. I pulled back from the eyepiece, my heart beginning a low, heavy drum against my ribs. It was impossible. The word itself felt inadequate. Fossilization, the process by which organic material is replaced by minerals, turning bone to rock, is a geological process. It requires thousands, often millions, of years under specific environmental pressures. For fossilized material to be found inside the fresh, modern bones of a girl who died less than 2 years ago is like finding a Roman coin baked inside a loaf of bread that just came out of the oven. It is a temporal and biological paradox of the highest order. It violates the fundamental laws that govern my entire field. In that moment, the familiar, comforting hum of the lab felt menacing. The sterile room felt like a tomb. For the first time in my career, I was looking at a set of remains that told a story I could not comprehend, a story written in a language that shouldn't exist. My own expertise ended where the laws of biology began to break down. For 2 days, I lived in a state of suspended disbelief, running the same scans, reprepping the same slides, and arriving at the same impossible conclusion. The intellectual vertigo was immense. I needed another mind, one untainted by my own rising sense of dread. I needed Dr. Isabel Reed. Isabel was the head of the university's paleogenetics lab, a brilliant, fiercely empirical scientist who lived in a world of precise data points and genomic sequences. Her lab was a stark contrast to my own analog world of bone and calipers. It was a place of humming sequencers, cryogenic freezers, and the soft, multicolored glow of data-rich monitors. When I called her, I was careful to frame my request in the driest possible terms, speaking of unidentified crystalline inclusions and potential diagenetic contamination. To have suggested anything else would have been professional suicide. She met me in her lab, her expression a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled impatience. I handed her the slide. Femoral cross-section from a recent Jane Doe, I said. WF 1138. She slotted it into her own high-powered microscope, leaning in with a practiced air. For a long moment, the only sound was the whir of a nearby centrifuge. Interesting, she murmured, her voice muffled. She adjusted the focus. Unusual morphology. Could be a rare form of fibrodysplasia, a teratoma with bone fragments, or severe contamination from the burial environment. Her skepticism was a lifeline, and I clung to it. She was offering me rational, if exotic, pathways back to the world I understood. Let's see what it's made of, she said, her voice all business. I'll run it through the mass spectrometer. Mass spectrometry is, in simple terms, a way of weighing molecules. It allows us to determine the exact chemical composition of a sample with breathtaking accuracy. It is an unbiased, unblinking eye that sees only the elemental truth. Isabel prepped a sample of the dark fragments, her movements quick and efficient. We waited. The results that spooled onto her monitor an hour later were the first casualty in her war for a rational explanation. The primary component was hydroxyapatite, the mineral basis of bone. But the trace element analysis was completely wrong. It showed levels of fluoride, manganese, and uranium enrichment consistent only with one process: long-term permineralization, fossilization. That's not possible, she stated, her brow furrowed as she stared at the glowing numbers. The elemental signature is that of a fossil, a very old one. Her skepticism was still present, but it was now laced with the same confusion I felt. The pathology theory was dead. The next logical step was radiocarbon dating. This process relies on a simple, beautiful constant. All living things absorb an isotope, carbon-14, from the atmosphere. When an organism dies, it stops absorbing, and the carbon-14 begins to decay at a perfectly predictable rate. By measuring how much is left, we can calculate the time of death with remarkable precision. Isabel, with her lab's new accelerator mass spectrometer, could get a date from a sample the size of a grain of salt. We prepared 2 samples under hermetically sealed conditions, one from the victim's own femoral bone, and one from the anomalous fragments we had painstakingly extracted. The results came back the following afternoon. They were not just contradictory, they were fundamentally insane. The sample from the victim's bone dated, as expected, to the modern era. The second sample, the fragments taken from inside that same bone, returned a date of 35,450 years BCE, plus or minus a few centuries, 37,000 years old. Isabel was pale. She ran the test again. The results were identical. "This is a contamination, Alistair," she insisted, her voice tight. "It has to be. The sample is compromised." But we both knew the protocols we had used were flawless. To find 2 materials so intimately fused, one from this millennium and one from the Pleistocene epoch, is not a contamination. It is a temporal impossibility. It's like finding a still-beating heart inside a block of Precambrian granite. There was only one test left: DNA. This was Isabel's sanctum sanctorum. For a week, She worked to isolate and amplify the severely degraded genetic material from the fossilized fragments. I found myself spending more and more time in my own lab late at night, staring at the skeleton of WF 1138. The sterile, ordered space of my lab had begun to feel different. It felt occupied. I started catching myself glancing toward the darkened corners of the room, a primal, irrational feeling prickling at the back of my neck, the distinct and impossible sensation of being watched. On the 8th day, Isabel called me. Her voice on the phone was a strained whisper. "Alistair, you need to see this." I found her staring at a long, complex sequence of genetic markers on her main screen. "I got a viable sequence," she said, not looking at me. "It's hominid, no question. Bipedal, large-brained. It's in our family." She finally turned to face me, her eyes wide with a terrifying awe. "But it's not us. It's not Homo sapiens. It doesn't match Neanderthal or Denisovan databases. It's a ghost, a sister lineage, an entirely unknown species of human." The pieces fell into place, forming a picture that science had no frame for. We hadn't just found an impossible fossil inside a modern skeleton. We had found the remains of a lost branch of the human family tree, hiding in the bones of a murdered girl. The scientific anomaly had escalated into a paradigm-shattering paradox. And as I looked from the impossible data on the screen to the open doorway of my own lab down the hall, I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that the persistent, watchful feeling I'd been having was not just my imagination. Something had been unearthed, and it was not entirely dead. The week that followed our discovery was a descent into a peculiar shared madness, cloaked in the language of scientific inquiry. Dr. Reed and I threw ourselves against the impossibility, determined to find a crack in its flawless, terrifying logic. Every rational explanation became a desperate prayer. Could it have been ritualistic? I proposed one morning, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Some fringe cult. Perhaps they ingested ground-up fossil material. It was a wild, absurd hypothesis. But it was at least a hypothesis, something that belonged to the world of human action, not geological paradox. We spent days cross-referencing missing persons reports with known cult activities in the Pacific Northwest. We found nothing. No whispers of rituals involving ancient bones. No belief systems that could account for this. The path was a cold, barren dead end. Dr. Reed, ever the empiricist, turned her focus to the physical location. "A geological anomaly," she insisted, pacing in front of the lab's whiteboard, which was covered in our frantic, contradictory notes. "There must be a unique mineral concentration at the burial site, something that could cause rapid, localized permineralization." We dispatched a forensics and geology team back to the remote patch of woods where the hikers had found the grave. They took soil samples, radiation readings, and geological cores. Their report came back a week later. The site was completely, depressingly normal. Standard forest loam, background radiation levels consistent with the region, no unusual mineralogy whatsoever. Her final bastion was contamination. "It happened here, Alistair," she said, her voice strained, gesturing around her own pristine lab. "A 1 in a billion chance. A fragment from another archaeological sample got into the prep solution, but she had no other Pleistocene-era hominid samples in her lab. We reviewed our own lab's intake logs for the last 5 years. Nothing. We checked the chain of custody records. Flawless. Every door to a rational world was methodically slamming shut in our faces, leaving us stranded with the impossible truth. And then the whispers began. Not of voices, but of data. I was running a micro-CT scan of the skull, attempting to map the exact distribution and density of the fossil fragments. The machine whirred, building a three-dimensional model on my screen slice by digital slice. As the scan focused on the temporal bone, an area with a high concentration of the dark inclusions, a sound trickled from the monitor's small speakers. It was a faint, rhythmic static. Shh, shh, shh. Like a distorted exhalation of breath. I paused the scan. The sound stopped. I resumed. It started again. A faint, dry whisper keeping perfect time with the scanner's pulse. I called in a technician. He ran a full diagnostic on the $500,000 machine. "Everything's nominal, Dr. Finch," he reported, shrugging. "Probably just some RF interference from another lab." But when he left and I ran the scan again, the whisper returned, a secret message being broadcast only when our most advanced technology peered into the deepest parts of the anomaly. A few nights later, unable to rest, I decided to review the security footage from the climate-controlled archive where WF-1138 was stored. The protocol was for the remains to be locked away each night. I sat in the darkened security office, the scent of stale coffee thick in the air, and spooled through the silent, time-lapsed footage. The camera showed the long, empty concrete corridor, the locked steel door to the archive room stark under the greenish night vision light. I watched hours of nothing. Then, at 3:17 a.m., I saw it. For a flicker of time, no more than 5 frames, a fifth of a second, the image distorted. A column of digital noise, a glitch in the feed, resolved itself into a shape. It was tall, impossibly thin, and vaguely human, standing directly in front of the archive door before dissolving back into nothing. My breath caught. I replayed the frames one by one. It was there, a ghost in the machine. I checked the system logs. No power fluctuations, no data packet loss, no errors recorded. It was an event that, according to the system, had never happened. The final manifestation was the most intimate and the most disturbing. I was alone in the lab, long after everyone else had gone home, performing a final series of measurements on the skeleton itself. The only light was the intense white circle from my articulated desk lamp. As I held the left femur, my calipers tracing the linea aspera, my perception shifted. For a single disorienting moment, the bone in my hands felt subtly longer, the muscle attachment points more rugged and pronounced than I remembered. I blinked, shaking my head, attributing it to the long hours. But when I looked up at the skull resting on its stand, its empty sockets staring into the gloom, the brow ridge seemed to lower, to become heavier and more primitive. It lasted only a second before snapping back to the familiar, gracile form of the young woman. It was a cognitive stutter, a hallucination born of stress. But it happened again the next night. My own senses, the most fundamental tools of my trade, were becoming unreliable. I was losing my grip on the solid ground of my life's work. The girl's skeleton was no longer just a set of remains. It was beginning to feel like something else, entirely. It was as if we were listening to a perfectly clear radio station, but occasionally a ghost signal from an ancient, long-dead broadcast would bleed through the static for a fraction of a second. Our equipment, our senses, were the receivers, and the skeleton on my table was the antenna. The exhaustion of pursuing dead ends left us in a strange, hollowed-out space. We had exhausted the rational world. Dr. Reed, who had been my anchor to the shores of reason, was now adrift with me. For days, she was quiet, running simulations. On her computers, her face illuminated by the cold blue light of the screens. Then, late one afternoon, she called me into her lab. She looked as though she hadn't slept in a week. "There's one more thing we can try, Alistair," she said, her voice raspy. "It's theoretical, Some would call it scientific heresy. But we're past that point, aren't we? She gestured to her monitor. Epigenetics. I knew the term, of course, but it was on the fringe of my own discipline. I waited for her to explain for the benefit of us both. Think of it this way, she began, her voice gaining a bit of its old professorial strength. DNA is the book of life, the permanent text. But epigenetics is the collection of bookmarks and sticky notes left by experience, trauma, environment, disease. These markers tell the body which pages to read, which genes to express or to silence. It's the memory of the cells. Her proposal was as audacious as it was brilliant. She wanted to sequence the epigenetic markers on both sets of DNA, our modern victim and our ancient ghost, to see if there had been any crosstalk, to see if one set of memories had somehow bled into the other. The process took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of holding my breath, of feeling the watchful presence in my lab grow from a quiet hum to a palpable pressure. Finally, the results were ready. I stood behind Isabel as the final data array populated on her screen. It was a complex cascade of color-coded methylation patterns, but the conclusion was stark, simple, and horrifying. In the victim's bone cells, specifically those in the immediate vicinity of the fossil fragments, the epigenetic markers had been fundamentally altered. They hadn't just been wiped clean. They had been overwritten, forced into a new pattern. A pattern that was a near-perfect match for the epigenetic markers on the 37,000-year-old DNA. Her cellular memory had been hijacked. All the pieces crashed together in my mind, forming a mosaic of absolute terror. I began to speak, the words emerging slowly as I gave voice to the theory that had been lurking in the shadows of my thoughts. "It's a palimpsest," I whispered. A palimpsest is a manuscript page from which the text has been scraped or washed off so that the page can be reused, but often faint traces of the original writing remain. She didn't just die out there, Isabel. She died in a state of extreme world-ending terror and agony. That level of trauma, maybe it made her receptive, a biological blank slate. And the spot where she died, by some impossible cosmic coincidence, it was the exact same spot where he died 37,000 years ago, likely in the same traumatic way. Her dying biology became a recording medium. His life, his consciousness, his final agony. It was imprinted onto her. The fossil fragments. They're not a contamination. They're the residue, the ink of the original text bleeding through. As the last word left my lips, the world outside the lab's panoramic windows seemed to die. The sky, which had been darkening all day, turned a bruised purple-black. A sudden gale of wind slammed against the glass with the force of a physical blow. The lights in the lab flickered once, twice, and then died. We were plunged into an abyssal darkness, which was immediately pierced by the stark green-white glare of the emergency lighting. The hum of the sequencers and ventilators vanished, replaced by a profound, ringing silence. In that silence, the sound returned. It came from the speakers of the main analysis computer, which was still running on a battery backup. The rhythmic, static, shh, shh, shh. But it was louder now, clearer. It had a texture, a guttural, resonant quality. It was not a whisper. It was the sound of something struggling to form words with a tongue and a larynx that were not designed for them. A wave of impossible cold washed through the room, raising gooseflesh on my arms. Instinctively, both of us turned toward the main examination room, visible through the interior glass wall. And we saw it. The skeleton of WF 1138 was laid out on the central steel table, stark under a single flickering emergency bulb. But it was not her skeleton. For a long, silent, screaming moment, we both saw the other. The form on the table was longer, the limbs more robust. The ribcage was deeper, more conical, and the skull was subtly, horribly different. The brow was heavy, the jaw more pronounced. It was the skeleton of a hunter, of something built for a harder, more brutal world. It was his skeleton. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with a pressure that felt like the weight of millennia. It was a presence not of malice, but of an unimaginable, ancient loneliness, and a terror that had been echoing in that one small patch of earth for over 30,000 years. My science, my reason, my entire world, it all fractured and fell away. I was no longer a doctor observing a specimen. I was a man in a dark room with a ghost that was wearing a dead girl's bones as a disguise. And, for the first time, it was letting the mask slip. The main lights hummed back to life with a sudden violent buzz. The oppressive silence was shattered, replaced by the familiar chorus of the lab's machinery spinning back up. The green-white emergency strobes died, and in the clean, unforgiving light of the main lamps, the thing on the table was gone. It was just a skeleton again, the skeleton of a teenage girl, nothing more. The vision, shared and absolute, vanished as if it had never been. Isabel made a choked, gasping sound and stumbled back, her hand clamped over her mouth. She stared at the bones, her face a mask of revulsion and disbelief, then turned and fled her own lab. I heard the sound of her being violently ill in the adjacent washroom. We never spoke of what we saw, not a single word. The subject became a void between us, a shared trauma so profound that acknowledging it would have been like trying to describe the colour of a vacuum. 2 weeks later, a dental records match gave our Jane Doe a name, Sarah Mills, a runaway from Oregon. With an identity attached, the final report was due. I sat at my desk for an entire day, the cursor on the blank document blinking with rhythmic indifference. How could I file a report on this? What language could possibly contain the truth? In the end, I did what the system required. I lied. Typed a document that was a masterpiece of clinical fiction. Subject, WF 1138, Mills, Sarah. Age, 18 plus, 1 year. Sex, female. Cause of death, cranial trauma consistent with blunt force impact. It was all true, in a shallow, meaningless way. I filled pages with metric data, with charts and figures, with the cold, hard poetry of forensic science. And then I came to the anomaly. My fingers hovered over the keyboard before I typed the sentence that would bury the impossibility forever. Microscopic analysis of bone marrow revealed the presence of unidentified foreign particulate contaminants of a crystalline geological origin. The source is unknown, pending further analysis, a bureaucratic epitaph for a 37,000-year-old ghost. I signed the report, closed the file, and sent it to the coroner. Case closed, but it wasn't. Isabel transferred to a university in Boston a month later. Her resignation email was brief and formal. We never communicated again. For my part, I tried to continue. I tried to walk into my lab each morning and see only the elegant puzzles of bone. But the sanctuary was desecrated. Every set of remains that came across my table was now a vessel of terrifying potential. I would find myself staring at a pelvic girdle or a metatarsal, my mind screaming with questions that had no place in my field. What did you see when you died? Where did you die? And who died there before you? My work, once my shield against the chaos of the world, had become a window looking directly into it. 6 months after filing the report on Sarah Mills, I tendered my own resignation. I packed my office, leaving behind the books, the awards, the 22 years of my life's work. I left my keys and my ID badge on the polished surface of my desk and walked out of the Oakhaven Human Identification Laboratory without looking back. Sarah Mills was given a proper burial in a small municipal cemetery. Her secret, and ours, was buried with her. I am an old man now. I write these words not for validation or belief, but simply to record the truth that I was forced to accept. The true horror of case WF 1138 was not that I saw a ghost. It was discovering the flimsy, arrogant nature of the reality I had dedicated my life to. I learned that the laws of physics are not immutable iron bars, but a delicate membrane, and that great trauma can tear it open. I learned that death is not always an ending. Sometimes it is merely a change in resonance. The universe is a far older and stranger house than we know, and it is filled with echoes. The terror is not that Sarah Mills wasn't alone in her grave. It's that her grave was never truly hers to begin with. And sometimes, on the quietest nights, when the wind is just right, I can still hear a faint, rhythmic static on the edge of hearing. A dry, lonely whisper from a time before humanity had a name for itself, waiting for another receiver to tune it in.